So the way that life works generally, if you look at the tree of life, and this is another way in which biology has kind of intruded into the question of the origin of life over the last couple of decades. What does the tree of life say about the very base, the kind of bacteria that are the most ancient, the very first ones? They're not the very first ones. These are things with genes, with enzymes. They're pretty sophisticated cells. This is the common ancestor of all of life as we know it. And you could say, well, it's not got much to do with the origin of life. Or you could say, well, perhaps it points in that direction. We can keep an open mind about that. So what does it do? What do these deepest branches in the tree of life do? Well, they're bacterial-like things, archaea and bacteria. And they're pretty much autotrophic, which means that they are converting gases in the environment into organic molecules, like photosynthesis, except probably not photosynthesis. And they're almost universally starting with CO2 and hydrogen. And that's the very core of biochemistry. You react CO2 and hydrogen, and you get Krebs cycle intermediates. That's the first things that you get. And from there, you get amino acids. And from there, you get nucleotides and so on. The problem is that hydrogen and CO2 don't react very easily. This is the problem that the chemists had for a long time. You can heat them up. You can add a catalyst. It does work, but it's difficult. It's only been in the last few years that people have succeeded in doing it. Now, what life does is it uses effectively an electrical charge on the membrane around the cell to drive that reaction. The problem is it's thermodynamically favored, which is to say, if you've got a mixture of hydrogen and CO2 and you mix them up at, say, 50 degrees centigrade, thermodynamically, you should get cells. It's actually more stable to have cells than it is to have a disequilibrium of hydrogen and CO2. They want to react, so long as there's no oxygen around. But kinetically, there's a barrier, and they don't react. And that kinetic barrier is broken down by this electrical charge on the membrane.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say you get cells, you don't mean cells as we know it as life. You mean that there's a membrane and it's oily and then there's a separation, or?
I mean that if you look at the this is theoretical thermodynamics that goes back to Jan Ammond and Tom McCollum, and they have considered under the kind of conditions that I'm thinking about, this is 20 years ago now, under the kind of conditions that I'm talking about in alkaline hydrothermal vents, at 50 degrees centigrade and alkaline conditions, energy is released to make amino acids and fatty acids, and overall total cell biomass releases energy from hydrogen and CO2. So, yes, it's favored. It's actually energetically more favored to have literally cells than it is to have a mixture of gases. That's what's driving life. The problem is that there's a barrier to it happening, and that barrier is broken down by this electrical charge on membrane. So my kind of driving question is, where did that come from? And how did it get going?
Why do you think it is that there's so much disagreement about the definition of life? So in mathematics, you just simply state the definition. There's no squabbling over that.
But have you come up with a definition of life in mathematics? I mean, the answer is no. It's basically, it's not easy to put it into an equation. I think that's, I personally think it's the wrong question, because life is a process over time. It's not a thing. And the origin of life is not a moment. There isn't one moment where something becomes alive. It's a continuum from prebiotic chemistry right the way up to, quite sophisticated cells with genes and macromolecular machines, motors and what have you. And every step along that way, there isn't one moment where you would say it's now alive. There's suddenly something goes like that. And you could argue about, is a virus alive or not? I would say it is, but it doesn't have a metabolism of its own, and it wouldn't fall within most definitions of life. What about jumping genes, retro elements, these kind of things? Are they alive? What about something which is dormant, a spore in deep space? Is it alive? No, it's not living now, but it could come back to life. So there's all these ambiguities about. I think what is living is a much better question. And, it's very easy to kind of wave your arms and say, well, it needs metabolism, it needs information, it needs compartmentalization. Those things are probably true. But more than that, any definition that you come up with of life can usually be attacked. The classic one is from It's known as the working definition of life from NASA, and I probably can't get this quite right, but it's roughly a self-sustaining system capable of making copies of itself, or capable of evolving, or something along those lines. And I have a real problem with the word self-sustaining, because it's basically sustained by the environment, by disequilibria in the environment. But people have poked fun at it by saying, well, by that definition, a rabbit is not alive. Only a pair of rabbits would be alive, because only a pair of rabbits could make a copy.
Right. Okay, so there's some arbitrariness to it, because it's akin to saying, when does a grain of sand become a heap, by adding more and more grains? Okay.
Yes.
So then it would be better to characterize it as a real number rather than 0 or 1.
It's certainly not binary, yes. I mean, you might even say death looks binary, doesn't it? But even death is not, because when we die, some of our cells will stay alive for a while longer. It feels binary, and therefore the origin of life perhaps feels binary for exactly the opposite reasons. You wonder about when does life begin in humans? There's terrible arguments about that kind of question, and there isn't really a correct answer to it either. If sperm are alive in some sense, but a fertilized egg is alive, but it's not really aware of very much. But where do you draw the line of where awareness comes in? It's basically an impossible ask, and it's a matter for people to try and come to an agreement about. But there isn't a definition.
So a better question may be, when is living, or what is living? I remember you said living, the word living versus life.
Yes. I mean, living is an active process over time, and it's a continuous reaction that is converting the environment into, in one way or another, more of itself. Whether that more of itself is just replace the broken bits, or if it's a case of make a copy of the whole cell, or fuse with another cell and go through some complicated process of sex and so on. But in the end, life is effectively parasitizing the environment to make copies of itself. And it does that through metabolism.
Okay, so 2 thoughts occur to me. So one is there a way to put a number, like I mentioned a real number, but perhaps it's not as simple as that. Is there a way to place a number to how much something is characterized by living? In the same way that you may say, well, consciousness is you either have it or don't. But then there's some theories like Tononi's integrated information theory, where you have phi, which is like, okay, if you have a large number. Okay, so that's the first thought. And then I'll say the second one, then I'll come back to them just so that I don't forget them. Then the second thought was, how far can we generalize this? Is so-and-so living? Because in the self-development world, when you walk by the sections in the library, they'll say, yeah, you're alive, but you're not living. We're not living your purpose.
Well, that's playing with semantics.
Okay, so that's taking it too far. Okay. So let's focus on the first one. Is there a way?
I mean, I'm using living in the broadest possible sense, in the sense of alive as well. But consciousness. If you look at the medical literature, there's all kinds of gradations of conscious states, whether you're fully anesthetized or fully unconscious, or in some lower level of consciousness, and so on. And it's worth looking at that medical literature every now and then to realize that it's not an on or off switch there either.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.